Transform all your company's milestones, big or small, into impact with Impact Hero. Whether it's a sale, a new hire, a demo booked, or anything else, with Impact Hero, you automatically generate a gift that matters, like a tree planted, a kilo of plastic recovered, or a piece of coral reef restored. Join the hundreds of companies that are already boosting sales and retention while making an impact. Go to impacthero.com/podcast now to get 10% off. Again, that's impacthero.com/podcast to get 10% off.
Welcome to another ClimateTech podcast, interviews with the people trying to save us from ourselves. Sebastian Pohlmann is CTO at UpCatalyst, a company that turns CO2 into graphite and other carbon-based products for use in applications like batteries. A German living in Estonia since 2019, he's bullish on sustainable ways to power the energy transition. I reached him in Tallinn. I'm Ryan Grant Little. Thanks for being here. Sebastian, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
As CTO at UpCatalyst, you're turning CO2 into graphite for batteries. And this sounds like one of these killing two birds with one stone situations, upcycling a waste product into a product that's necessary for the energy transition. And it also strikes me as something that you don't just come up with as an idea on a Sunday afternoon. So where did the idea for this come from?
Yeah, the idea for this came from a spin-off in university. So here in Estonia, in Tartu University, they actually found out how to electrolyze CO2 back into carbon. Well, they didn't find it out. This technology exists, but what they found out is how to do it for specific carbon allotropes. So how to make specific forms of carbon out of CO2 by splitting it electrochemically.
And so and these types of carbon, so I mentioned graphite. Are there other kinds of carbon that you're using as well?
Yeah, we can also make carbon nanotubes. So very thin wires made out of carbon. And these have also a lot of applications in battery space and composite materials, let's say in upcoming materials, a lot of new applications using carbon nanotubes.
Cool. I want to talk about the applications a little bit as well. Can you explain kind of in layperson's terms how this works? So what does the process actually look like to turn CO2 back into carbon?
Sure. So this works a little bit like aluminum smelting. So that doesn't tell you anything in layperson's terms, but it is a molten salt electrolysis. What does it mean is that it works at fairly high temperatures, around 600 to 800 degrees Celsius, in a molten salt. So instead of having an electrolysis like you normally have electrolysis of water, which is done in water, you use another liquid, which is a molten salt. If you heat up a salt, even table salt, if you heat it up to high enough temperatures, it becomes liquid. And what we do is we use carbonate salts, so salts that already have the carbon dioxide dissolved in them, and we can dissolve more carbon dioxide in them. So we pump the carbon dioxide into this molten salt. And then we have two electrodes in there that apply a voltage and a current flows. And that current goes directly into the carbon dioxide molecules. So it adds enough electrons on one side to strip the oxygen from the carbon. And you're left with solid carbon on one side and with oxygen on the other side. So you have oxygen bubbles forming on the other side and just escaping into the atmosphere. Okay, and
I want to talk to you more about salt in a minute as well, because I was actually out from the last week tonight with John Oliver. There was a piece on deep sea mining and talked about, maybe you saw this recently, but talked about batteries from salt. And it sounds like maybe there's some crossover here. So what about the economics of this? And let's talk also a bit about the market. For me, turning CO2 back into carbon sounds a bit like putting toothpaste back into the tube. How do the economics look for this relative to kind of the traditional but dirtier forms of mining carbon?
Surprisingly, they don't look too bad. So if you compare it to mining carbon, to mining especially graphite, because graphite can be mined, then mining graphite is normally a little bit cheaper, but mining graphite doesn't give you the graphite that you need for lithium-ion batteries. So you need to still treat the mined graphite, and then you have a lot of other energy expenses. There are other ways how to make graphite. Most battery graphite today is actually made synthetically from petroleum coke. And this is very energy intensive. So petroleum coke they are taken and heated up using fossil fuel energy again. to around 2,900 degrees Celsius. So very high temperatures. And at these temperatures, if you exclude oxygen, every carbon turns at some point into graphite. That is how they synthetically make graphite in a nutshell. For nanotubes, the process is also quite high temperature and also fossil fuel based. So you use natural gas and use a process called chemical vapor deposition at around 1,200 degrees Celsius. So again, very high temperatures, much higher than the temperatures that we use. So while it is actually our process, taking toothpaste and putting it back into the tube, the other processes use much, much higher temperatures. So our main energy expense is the electricity that we use to split up the carbon dioxide molecule. The other guy's main energy expense is heating up the process. So cost-wise and energy-wise, we are actually energy-wise better off. And cost-wise also, especially on the carbon nanotube part, much better off when making carbon nanotubes our way.
Okay, so getting toothpaste out of the tube at 2,900 degrees is actually quite expensive as well.
Exactly, yeah.
And what about the market size? So can you just paint the picture of what's the demand for graphite, for nanotubes globally right now? And how do you see alternatives like this playing a role in cutting into that as a supplier?
Yeah. The market size we can split it into two things, into nanotubes and graphite. So for graphite, the main market today is the battery market. You use graphite actually today in a lot of other things. A pencil uses graphite, but the graphite that you can use in a pencil is very low quality graphite. You don't need really high purity or anything. For batteries, you need extremely high purity graphite, and graphite is these layers of carbon atoms, right? And the lithium ions in the lithium-ion battery, they move in between these layers. That's what happens when you charge a lithium-ion battery, just for context. The average lithium-ion battery uses about 1 kilogram of graphite per kilowatt hour of stored energy. That means every electric vehicle has around 60 to 70 kilograms of graphite in it. And that means that if you make synthetic graphite with the current method, for the graphite alone, you have around 1.2, 1.3 tons of CO2 emitted just for making the graphite. Which is still, it's not too bad, but it's still quite bad, especially given the amount of electric vehicles that we want to make, and cutting down on these emissions is quite important. So that market alone is huge, of course, because of the amount of batteries that will be made in the future. If you take the projections of the battery industry, then we look at 4 to 5 terawatt hours in 2030 of batteries being made. So 1 terawatt hour is 1 million megawatt hours. Well, 1 megawatt hour takes around 1 ton of graphite. So we are talking about millions of tons of graphite that needs to be made, especially in the coming years. So that's the one part. The other part is the nanotubes. So nanotubes are also used on batteries. Average electric car uses about 500 grams to 1 kilogram of nanotubes. And nanotubes are much more carbon intensive, so they emit a lot more carbon emissions per kilogram of nanotubes. And here it's not only the battery market. It is actually here, half of the market is the battery market. The other half is other things like composite materials, even the concrete market, and anything that can be structurally improved on a molecular level. And concrete, for example, there are a lot of studies showing that if you add nanotubes, you can improve concrete strength by 20, 30%. And these kind of applications, again, also save emissions because you can use less concrete to build the same building, just as an example. So here, the market size is, in total, if you take the serviceable addressable market for nanotubes alone, for both the battery market and the other markets, it's in 2030 estimated to be around $50 billion US. So there's a lot of different applications which can utilize these products.
And how are you taking the CO2? How does that supply look? Are you attaching to the exhaust of a cogen, or what does that look like exactly?
That's a very good question. We even sometimes get the question, is there even enough CO2 to do it? Sadly, there is. There's much, much more than we actually need.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yes. We cannot hook up, sadly, directly to the exhaust of a generator or to the exhaust of a concrete plant or something like this. We need relatively pure CO2, about 98, 99% purity. But these purities are today available if you have CO2 washing process after your standard exhaust. So the concrete industry is already doing that. Not every concrete plant, but A lot of concrete plants are already building these CO2 washing units in order to prepare for CO2 utilization, because they have some of the hardest to abate emissions globally. So concrete is kind of this, you have 8% of global carbon emissions, and at the same time, they're extremely hard to abate because you cannot replace the emissions with something else. You cannot avoid them by going to solar or going to wind energy. That's not possible. So generally, how we see it is we would build our larger factories next to these large-scale emitters, whether that's concrete or cement factories in this case, or waste incineration plants. So waste incineration is, in Europe at least, one of the larger ways how to get rid of your waste. And they emit a lot of CO2, and they have very high pressure by regulation to abate these CO2 emissions as well. Today, at the smaller scale that we operate today, so pilot scale, we actually use already CO2 from biogas. So biogas that you get from a biogas plant is around 40% CO2. That CO2 has no energy value, and it normally is split from the methane. And that CO2 can then be, of course, just emitted, but a lot of biogas installations don't want to emit it, of course. They want to store it or utilize it, and that's where we come in.
Interesting. So basically looking at co-locations with large emitters, and would you be working with them in partnership, or would you set up projects as like joint ventures with them? Is that kind of the idea?
Yeah, the idea is that the very first large-scale installations we will build ourselves, and we will operate them ourselves, and we will basically take CO2 as a feedstock from somebody who is wanting to get rid of it. There will most probably be some kind of remuneration involved regarding CO2 certificates, something like that. That is something that we're currently figuring out with these partners. After that, we actually are considering to go rather for a licensing model. We have the technology. We can tell people how to set it up next to your emission plant, and then we rather focus on the product quality. We rather focus on the actual battery-grade graphite, on the nanotubes, and how to create value from those.
I work with a lot of companies who plan to open up shop in or expand across Europe. My one big piece of advice: don't fall into the trap of setting up a new entity right away. Instead, talk to my friends at Paracar, who can help you get up and running without all the costs, not to mention the legal and HR hassle. When I was hiring in different EU countries, I wanted my team to focus on their work, not on the country's bureaucracy. After interviewing a half dozen international expansion firms, I chose Paracar because they were by far the most knowledgeable, and they're great people. Whether you're a large multinational looking to expand abroad, a small business looking for the right talent, or a contractor, they'll sort it out. Book a free, no-obligation consultation right now at paracar.eu/climate. That's PARAKAR.eu/climate. Interesting. We talked about batteries for EVs, for smartphones, that type of thing. Are there any other applications that you're targeting that work with this kind of carbon?
For graphite, of course, it's batteries all over the place, whether that's batteries for EVs or smartphones or stationary storage. But for graphite, it's all batteries. Then for the nanotubes, it is half the market is batteries. The other half is, as I said, composite materials. It can be improvement of concrete strength, can be paints and coatings, functional coatings especially, because nanotubes make everything a little bit more conductive. So if you want a black conductive coating or a coating that is very good at conducting thermally as well, then nanotubes make a lot of sense. The third thing that we haven't talked about yet, what we're also doing is we also have a product made from biomass. So it's also a CO2 negative product, which is a hard carbon. And that hard carbon is actually used in sodium-ion batteries. So sodium-ion batteries are kind of the next big thing that is coming up in the battery space. CATL, for example, has already launched one sodium-ion battery. And we see that this is quite an important battery market to follow in. And the graphite cannot be used in sodium-ion batteries. So what they use in sodium-ion batteries is a different form of carbon. It's called hard carbon. And we are also offering a product in that space.
You're totally stealing my thunder here, Sebastian, because I even have a point here about CATL in China, which is the largest battery manufacturer in the world. And they're making these sodium-ion batteries and supplying them to EV companies, the major one being Chery, which is also a Chinese one. And I was going to ask you what your take is on this technology, but if it's on your roadmap as kind of the third product, I think that answers it.
Yeah, it is. I can expand a little bit on our take on it. So the sodium-ion battery is generally regarded in the battery space as definitely a large part of the technology mix coming up in the future regarding energy storage. Why? Because it doesn't use lithium, is much safer than lithium-ion batteries. It doesn't necessarily use cobalt. It can be discharged to 0 volts, so you can transport it more safely and store it more safely. There are a lot of benefits of this, but most importantly, it's cheaper. For per kilowatt hour, you can probably get sodium-ion to levels that are 15, 20, 30% cheaper than what you get from a lithium-ion battery. And for stationary storage, that is a huge game changer, because suddenly it becomes very viable to install large stationary battery installations next to wind farms, solar farms, and secure the energy supply from renewables.
And so, and I mean, also the accessibility of salt is much easier than some of the more difficult precious metals that are, in geopolitically unstable places, or as is the case with deep sea drilling, kind of in the deepest parts of the sea. And I'll go back to the John Oliver episode of Last Week Tonight again, where he's talking about the metal company, which is looking to basically harvest the deepest part of the seabed in order to get materials for batteries. And I wonder, working with some of the more sustainable approaches like you're talking about and with salt, is there a way to obviate this altogether so that we don't have to continue with the most hazardous for the environment and for people types of mining? Or is this a kind of everything required solution in order to electrify the world? I mean, we're trying to shift the entire planet into an electrified world. And so I can imagine that it might take everything that we've got in order to do it within a time frame that doesn't put us over a 3+ degrees of warming.
Of course, I think the concern always needs to be how to get the metals that we need in order to get fully renewable and get carbon neutral in our energy landscape without damaging the environment too much. I think it would be foolish to think that we can do it without damaging the environment overall. But we also need to consider that we are switching, right? We are not doing something new. We're actually switching from something much more harmful, which is deep sea drilling already, which is oil and gas. And that's a quote, I actually don't remember from whom, but we're switching from an oil and gas-based energy system to a metal-based energy system. The good thing about metals is you can recycle them, right? Oil and gas, you cannot recycle. I mean, that's kind of what we are trying to do. We're trying to get the CO2 back into carbon form. But generally, oil and gas products, the final product is CO2, and you cannot recycle that really well. Whereas metals, you can recycle. So I agree that maybe we should think about before going to deep sea mining. It sounds also very costly, and there might be just deposits elsewhere that are easier accessible. But I also think that we're globally in this phase where we are trying things out. It's still new to a lot of people. I mean, think about how the lithium-ion battery looked in the 90s. Then people never thought that a lithium-ion battery would be available below 1,000 euros per kilowatt hour. Today we are already at 50. So that is something where a lot of learning is going on. There's a learning process and also learning process on the supply chain. So I'm pretty sure that we need to closely watch it in order to figure it out, but we will figure out how to get the metals we need without necessarily destroying all of our ecosystems.
Yeah, some of our listeners will be, like me, old enough to remember carrying around the giant Motorola phone and laptops that basically break your back with the weight of these batteries. You mentioned that UpCatalyst is a spin-out of Tartu University. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about kind of the role of academia in the work that you do and what kind of connections you still have with them or with other universities in working on R&D or life cycle analyses or any of these kinds of things.
Yeah. So we work a lot with universities. We actually hosted currently, most of our laboratories are hosted in university laboratory space that we have rented specifically for these purposes. And we are now slowly growing out of this phase where we go into a larger facility that is next to a waste incineration plant here in Tallinn in Estonia. But generally, this connection between industry and academia is quite important in this early phases of the startup as well, because the earliest validation that you get of your process or get of your product is normally from academia. It's not from customers, because academia is willing to test for free and is willing to share the report then afterwards with everybody else. But also academia has a lot of assets that are available for you to use without having to spend millions of euros on measurement equipment, right? So there's electron scanning microscopes and all these kind of things that are quite expensive to buy, but are not that expensive if you just want to buy maybe 3 to 10 tests or something. So that's something that where we definitely work with academia, but we also work in a lot of grant projects with academic institutions all around Europe. So Europe has, I would say, a very successful grant structure when it comes to these research projects where industry works together with academia. And there we work with universities and research institutes all around Europe.
Oh, that sounds great. Yeah, I'm aware that a lot of these programs require kind of an industry part and an academic part, and then there's sort of a negotiation around what information is provided publicly and what's allowed to kind of stay as your IP. And some universities do that very well. Some are still kind of figuring it out, especially when it comes to a lot of the climate tech stuff where it's a public good, this information, there's a real public need to open source it. But at the same time, there's a need for you to be able to protect your IP. Your latest funding round was led by Berlin's Extantia, which I consider to be one of the finest climate tech investors in the world. And listeners can go all the way back to episode number 5 and hear partner Carlotta Ochoa-Nevin Dumont's episode on this podcast. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the path forward looks like. This doesn't sound like a cheap venture. What does a path forward look like in terms of financing?
First of all, Extantia will be very happy to hear that you think that highly of them. We, of course, think also very highly of them, and work with them has been very great so far. Of course, to answer your question, of course, this is capital intensive. It's deep tech, and we need a lot of capital expenditure to make this happen. To build these large electrolysis reactors, it costs a lot of money, and to especially build something for the first time costs a lot of money. It is capital expensive. It is not as expensive as some people might think. So when we talk to our customers or our partners as well on the carbon capture side, then they expect much higher sums than we normally tell them that it will cost to abate their emissions. But it is still capital intensive, and that's also why we, of course, will consider additional funding rounds. So the good thing is about all of this is that the carbon dioxide is such a huge pain for anybody who's emitting it that most people are focused on also spending some money to get rid of their carbon dioxide emissions or abate them somehow. And some of these are even the same people that would then use the products. So some of them actually would use carbon nanotubes at the same time while emitting a lot of CO2 emissions. So they have a win-win situations with this technology. And of course, these are the partners that we are starting to work with now to also figure out how much of this will still be venture capital funded, how much of this will already be partner funded.
Interesting. And then they love the story also that they can make this very closed loop, right? When it's when they're both the consumer and the producer of the CO2 and the offsets. So makes a lot of sense.
And it's not only a story in that sense. Yeah. So, of course, we see a lot of stories when it comes to climate tech, because a lot of people just want to have a nice green label somewhere on their product. But in terms of concrete, for example, then you have all the emissions from cement, which are huge. But you also have nanotubes in concrete, which are taken out of the carbon cycle for 100, 150 years at least, because concrete is never burned or very rarely burned at these temperatures that you would release these carbon emissions again. So it's also important to think about whenever somebody tells you, okay, we're taking carbon out of the atmosphere, or we abate carbon emissions and we're putting it somewhere, that how long will it stay there? Will it stay there for 10 years? Then you're not really taking it out of the carbon cycle. If you take it out of the carbon cycle for 100, 200 years, then you start to make a dent.
Really drill in on that somewhere aspect of it.
Yes.
Who would you like to hear from, and what kind of people who are listening could help you further your mission, Sebastian?
We would like to hear from, first of all, we are always happy if somebody's interested in what we are doing. We're a small company. We are always happy to talk about it. So anybody who wants to learn more should definitely reach out to us. Of course, we are very happy to hear from companies that have the pain of CO2 emissions and would like to get rid of them, and maybe even already have an idea, wait a minute, I have a battery plant that has CO2 emissions and I need graphite, so maybe let's combine the two. These stories also exist. And finally, of course, speaking of investments, then of course also anybody who is interested in further investing into these kind of technologies is of course welcome to contact us.
And as always, I'll put your LinkedIn and website in the show notes. Sebastian, thanks so much for talking today.
Thank you, Ryan. It was great talking to you.
Thanks for listening to another ClimateTech podcast. It would mean a lot if you would subscribe, rate, and share this podcast. Get in touch anytime with tips and guest recommendations at hello@climatetechpod.com. Find me, Ryan Grant Little, on LinkedIn. I'll be back with another episode next week. Bye for now. This episode is supported by Grizzle, B2B content to create and capture demand. I first met Grizzle's founder, Tom Watley, 5 years ago at a conference in Dublin. I was so impressed that I signed a deal with him to do all my software company's content that same evening at the pub. Remember that, Tom?
Kinda.
And they're still doing it 2 years after we sold the company because the new owners love Grizzle as much as I do. If you sell B2B, book 30 minutes in Tom's calendar at grizzle.io/climate. That's GRIZZLE.io/climate.